This is Facepalm America. I'm Beowulf Rockland. Facepalmamerica.com is where you can go for more information on the show. The American workplace is a funny kind of institution. It is a place where we get together and interact in a lot of ways, and we don't always think of it as a locus of problematic and racist things, but it can be, even if we personally disclaim racism and are not personally racist. The very structure of the way we interact with one another in the workplace can perpetuate racism and be extremely problematic in a way that defies efforts, many of them so far, to move past that. And so I wanted to speak today with Adia Harvey Wingfield. She's a professor of sociology at Washington University in St. Louis and the 2018 president of Sociologists for Women in Society, and she is the author of Gray Areas: How the Way We Work Perpetuates Racism and What We Can Do to Fix It. Adia, welcome to Facepalm America. Thank you so much for being here today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So, structural racism is something that throughout the history of the United States, throughout the history of the world, has perpetuated racism in a way that transcends the individual. And in the modern workplace, even though you might not have folks who are biased and racist, the structure sort of imposes this on us in many ways. How does it do that? How when we get together does just the very setup of an office or the structure of a company create that racism, even if it might not be something that is intended, at least by us as individuals?
Sure. So this is what I really try to spend a lot of time highlighting in the book. The idea behind gray areas are that they are parts of work that are distinct from the core functions of a job itself, but they are also parts of work that have the potential to perpetuate and maintain ongoing racial inequalities. So by way of example, my job is that I'm a college professor. I'm required to do research, to teach, to do service, sometimes way more service than I think I should be doing.
Right.
But those are the core parts of my job. But those are not all that is encompassed in my job. My job also involves forming connections with people who might potentially be references and people who could refer me to potential jobs that might open up. My job also involves navigating organizational culture and understanding what that is in a particular workplace and being aware of how to navigate it so that I'm successful at work. And then my job also offers opportunities for advancements depending on what types of connections and relationships that I have to the process for moving up. So when I talk about gray areas, I'm talking about those things: the social, the cultural, the relational parts of our job, which are not quite explicitly regulated, but are still parts of work and are a little bit more ambiguous in ways that allow racial inequality to thrive.
So, for example, if you have to, in order to advance, which most people do to a degree, engage in office politics, and the office politics has a racist tinge to it, which limits you in terms of advancing up the ladder, then even though that aspect of it might not specifically be addressed, it's still there and it still functions to hold you back.
Right, exactly. When we think about advancement in particular, a lot of the ways that we advance today have to do with the recommendation from a mentor or sponsor, or being mentored or sponsored in the first place. But we also know that Black workers report more distance from their mentors and sponsors than other workers. We also know that they are less likely to have those close relationships. They are less likely to be the people who are recipients of that specific type of attention. And so what that means is that when the way we work involves putting that much onus on a sponsor or mentor, who we know statistically is less likely to have a closer relationship with Black workers, those workers become disadvantaged by that process. Not necessarily because that manager is intentionally trying to exclude them or hold them back, but it's simply the processes of how we work and how we advance that create that outcome.
Certainly, and if the the mentors are people who are not people of color predominantly, it's going to be more problematic in terms of creating these relationships. There's an enormous amount of effort, especially in larger companies and larger organizations, put into diversity, equity, equality, and inclusion programs, and it seems like those aren't necessarily making the kind of progress that we would hope. How do those function, and what are they missing that you are getting at here in Gray Spaces?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it may be counterintuitive or surprising to some of your listeners, given how ubiquitous diversity trainings are. But the data here are pretty conclusive. And what they show is that mandated diversity trainings simply do not work. They do not improve the numbers of Black workers in leadership. In fact, they often can do the opposite and depress those numbers. And data has shown that there are a couple of ways that happens. For white workers, when they are mandated to attend diversity trainings, they may become resentful. They feel as if they are being forced to do something. And maybe more importantly, they feel as if, rightly or wrongly, they are being blamed and they are being suggested that they're doing something wrong and that there's potential litigation at the end of that road. But perhaps paradoxically, for Black workers, I found that they also are often not a huge fan of diversity initiatives, or mandated diversity trainings. And often that's because they see those as an exercise in regulatory compliance and less of a good faith effort from the organization to address the very real issues and challenges that they face in the workplaces, the types of things that I try to identify in gray areas. Those things often aren't addressed by mandatory diversity training.
Yeah, that brings up an interesting question for me. How often is an effort like that something that's built internally, and how often is it just outsourced to somebody else?
Yeah, that's a key part of the problem. In many cases, this work is outsourced to people who are not employees of the company. Consultants get hired, they come in for a period of time, they do the training, they collect their cash, and they move on. And that also helps for workers to feel a bit of distance from the process, because it's not people who are embedded in and invested in the company. It's not people who are invested in the company's success. It's someone that they barely know or may not know at all, coming in for a couple of sessions to do this work and then going on their way without that deep connection to the company that can make a difference.
So how do companies or organizations go about building successful, organic, internal systems for diversity and inclusion? What have you seen that works?
Yeah, so this is exciting because there actually is research that does document what companies can do. For one thing, replacing mandated diversity training with diversity task forces is a critical step that has been shown to document cultural change and the change in the number of workers of color and Black workers in leadership roles. And this is because when leaders pull together people from different levels of the company and task them with identifying and solving a problem, that feels different than feeling as if you're being blamed for the problem or as if company is not really interested in finding solutions or addressing what the problems are in the first place. So task forces that pull from a number of different levels of the organization can matter a lot. Mentoring programs that are open to everyone can make a big difference because they address some of what I was talking about before, those gaps in terms of who has access to supervisors and managers. When there are mentoring programs that just happen organically, people are more likely to pair off with those who look like themselves. And when we have disproportionately white workers in leadership, that means that they disproportionately are pairing off with other white workers. But when we have mentoring programs that are open to everyone, that anyone can sign up for and be guaranteed a mentor match, we know that Black workers are more likely to sign up for these programs, and they are more likely to benefit from these relationships with other managers who might otherwise not even cross their radar and not know about them. And managers are incentivized to want to support them because people are creatures who want to see themselves look good. It looks good for the mentor to see the mentee succeeding. And I document some of that in the book when I talk about the experience of Darren, who's a worker in a corporate setting, who really benefited from some of these mentoring programs and that he identified as a critical factor in his own success in the workplace.
Well, that's fantastic. It's good to know that there are systems that seem to be working. I'm wondering how prevalent that is, because it seems to take more than just a minimal amount of effort to get it to work, and the default is kind of just to outsource it. and if you really want to get at the problem as opposed to just say that you've dealt with the problem, it takes a lot more focus, not even necessarily resources per se, but focus and attention.
That's true. But a good thing about these types of programs is that they bring in multiple people at multiple levels of the organization. And that's critical because it offsets what we were discussing a moment ago in terms of a consultant coming in and spending a day or two at a company, collecting a check, and then moving on. When it becomes everybody's collective responsibility to identify and solve these problems, that actually takes a lot of the burden off of Black workers who we know have done a disproportionate amount of often unpaid and unacknowledged labor to try to address these racial issues themselves. And it becomes more evenly spread. It becomes something that everybody can take stock in and take ownership of, and something that everybody can be part of in terms of creating solutions.
It seems really weird to me and unfortunate to have to focus so much on the sensitivities, frankly, of white people, because it's enormously frustrating given what the history and the context is to all of this, and we're focusing on workplaces specifically, but given the enormous history. And I look at the news and see this in so many other places where white people are just like really worked up that they feel like they're being blamed for stuff, and so they go out and screw with things like kids' libraries in schools and create a lot of problems, and yet it seems like what you're saying does deal with like white sensitivities, frankly, to a certain extent, and that being key to it. I guess what I'm asking is how do you deal with that sort of reaction and acknowledge it without kind of completely catering to it? Because it seems like completely catering to it would be the wrong thing to do. I mean, and redirecting and educating in a deep way would seem to be the solution, but how do you walk that line? It seems like a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that goes back to this question of organizational culture and ways to shift culture so that companies are not operating in the ways that they have been. One of the things that I talk about in the book is how common it is for many companies to put forth and to endorse what we might call a colorblind organizational culture, where the idea is that it's taboo to talk about issues related to race. It's gauche, it's impolite, it's just not something that's done, because the better option is just to focus on getting the work done and everybody staying away from topics that could be taboo or divisive. But I also learned from my research that for many Black workers, that colorblind orientation is really very counterproductive. Because what it does is it creates an organizational culture and a norm where when they experience or try to point out racial challenges that they experience, there's no language and no framework for which other colleagues in the organization can understand what's happening to them and how they are experiencing those spaces. So to me, I think it becomes critical to think about this organizational shift and moving away from a colorblind culture, because that does shift the focus and attention away from centering white workers' feelings and their uncertainties and their doubts and every other aspect of how they may emotionally be responding to these issues. And it makes us more attuned to how there's room for, or should be room for everybody and for all workers to have their experiences become a core part of how the organization's culture operates.
Have you seen a workplace ever become a genuine place of like education and understanding beyond just like getting along during work hours? Have you ever seen moments where this truly did create a greater understanding in addition to just a better basic interaction between people?
Right. Well, in the conclusion of the book, I talk about 3 separate cases of real life organizations that have addressed the things that I talk about with varying degrees of success.
Right.
So I talk about Google, Coca-Cola, and GV, which is a venture capital firm. And each of these has dealt with and grappled in different ways with these questions of gray areas when it comes to hiring, when it comes to organizational culture, and when it comes to advancement. And I think there are some instructive